Welcome to the Story of Everything, Session 2. Hopefully you had a chance to be a part of Session 1, where we talked about the nature of God. The big idea for that session was that God exists in a community of grace that we call the Trinity. And because we are created in God's image, we are also wired up for living in a community of grace. When God created everything in the beginning, God's creation was good. The way that God created it was meant for us to be able to live life to the fullest. But we all know that something has gone terribly wrong in our world. We experience pain, broken dreams and relationships, and death. And while there are certainly moments when it seems like everything is great, there's lots of moments when it seems like something has gone terribly wrong. And this is the story of sin. Whether it's a broken relationship with God, other people, or even broken relationships with the world and all the disasters we experience, the story of everything describes these dilemmas as coming from sin. We were never wired up to live in death and pain. That was never God's intention, and that's why it hurts so bad and creates so much confusion. Sin is an intentional decision to live in a way that God never intended. It's a different story than the story of grace. Sin ruins the community of grace that God originally designed. If we're honest, we know that we've all contributed to the brokenness of our world. We might be tempted to think that our sin is done in private and doesn't affect relationships, but sin always has a price that affects relationships. In this session, we'd love for your group to discuss the idea of sin as being something relational. Sin takes place when people put themselves at the center of community and make choices around what's going to please them alone. When we go it alone and abandon the interest of God's grace-filled community, we will experience the effects and the consequences of sin. Now, the story of sin isn't just about rules and regulations. It's about preserving and protecting that community of grace and living the way that God designed in that community. So, as you have your discussions in your group, we have to remember that sin is relational. And the idea of repenting or turning around is directional because it leads us back to the way that God desires us for us to live life to the fullest within that community of grace. So repenting isn't just about feeling bad about things that we've done. It's not about getting our life in order. It's about changing the direction of the story that we're living so that we can begin to live in the direction of God's story. Whenever we contribute to the building of life-giving community, we begin to restore the brokenness that sin has caused. Now, we're not going to ask you to air all your dirty laundry and confess your deepest, darkest sins during this session. But we do want you to reflect on the ways in which you might need to alter the direction of your story so that you can begin to experience the abundant life that God wired you up for. Ultimately, we hope that you can begin to experience the grace of a community that's been redeemed by God. Grace existed before sin ever did. Some people might think that grace was just God's response to sin, but the idea we want you to take away is that grace came first. Grace existed before sin ever did, because before anything was created, God existed in that community of grace. And grace is always there for us because it's at the center of time and existence. Even in the midst of our ongoing struggle with sin, it's grace that is there and rescues us. Now, this is certainly not the end of the story. If we ended right here with this session, it'd be a terrible story. Every good story has to have a way to resolve the major conflict. And in our next session, we're going to explore how God did deal with sin and begin to restore his dream for the world through the story of Jesus. And it's a story that God invites all of us to be a part of. So, enjoy your small group time.